So, hi everyone. We've been chatting, Piers and I. Hello, Piers.
Hello.
It's part two today. So, last time in our first conversation, which I'm going to post the link to, we sort of looked at the sort of zoomed out picture of the territory. There is the spiritual traditions and practices for anyone who maybe is new to it or slightly overwhelmed with what to choose, what to look at. And so we were basically talking about the PS's latest book, Lamp Onto Yourself, and which I highly recommend. And today we're doing sort of the opposite of that. We're going to be talking about PS's upcoming book, which is not yet published, but it's parts of it are available on the website, which I'm also going to put a link to. And so, PS, maybe let's start from you telling us a little bit about what that second book is about
Yeah, sure.
and what leads you to write it.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me on for part two here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Uh,
I'm so thrilled.
yeah. So people who followed along with part one, where we talked about the book Lamp Unto Yourself in more detail, will know that that book is really intended to be sort of like an entree, like an entry point into spirituality. We agreed that it could be very helpful for people who are already sort of deeply embedded in spirituality, but just kind of like in one corner for them to get a sense of the overall bigger picture. But really, the book is intended to sort of lead people into finding the spiritual traditions and practices that they're going to connect with and that they're going to get into. And I would say it kind of it gives you a little taste, little glimpse of what can come, but it's not really a book about the awakening process.
Hmm.
So multidharma, which is the name of the next book, and you mentioned a good chunk of the book, about like over half of it is available on multidharma.net, which is a company companion website that I've put up while the book is. I actually have written the manuscript, but it takes a press, about a year to do the copy editing, cover design, like all, the marketing, all the stuff that presses
Yeah.
have to do. So it won't actually come out until about a year from now. But the material's written, and I've, talked about it in various podcasts and interviews and so forth. And so I'm just making that available through the website because I think it's important to get the information out. So what multidharma does is essentially picks up from where Lamp Unto Yourself leaves off. So, Multidharma is a book for people who are in an awakening process, who have had actual experiential gotten the experiential flavor of what these practices have to offer, and are starting to experience some of the fruits of those practices. But it's also still doing the same kind of thing that Lamp Unto Yourself was doing, which is just orienting people to a larger territory and kind of explaining sort of how things fit together and where you might only have a partial view of the whole territory, and kind of giving you a broader perspective. And so the book is it's kind of a companion piece, or kind of bookends these two books. Like, one is kind of like, getting into the awakening process, and then this one picks up and sort of like moves all the way through the awakening process. Both of them sort of painting a broader picture, giving you a sense of the lay of the land beyond just the one tradition or perspective that you might be familiar with. And the other difference between the two is that Lamp Unto Yourself is really only focused on Asian traditions, and then kind of modern interpretations of Asian traditions. So things like Buddhism, Hinduism, yoga, qigong, kind of traditional practices, and then modern versions of those like mindfulness and so on and so forth. Um, multidharma is claiming to be speaking about more universal kind of processes that take place within, or more universal features of the awakening process. So I'm claiming that there are similarities in the process of awakening between not only Asian traditions but also Western and other traditions, and I'm creating a whole sort of like structure so that the reader can understand what the similarities might be, say, between like Christian mysticism and Buddhist, Mahayana Buddhist compassion
Mm-hmm.
practice, what the similarities and differences might be between, say, Advaita style self-inquiry versus, I don't know, Taoist or Zen style meditation, right? And understanding sort of the whole landscape of spirituality through through a framework that the book provides. So it's even broader in that sense than Lamp Unto Yourself, but it's written for more kind of advanced practitioners or people who are more steeped in the spiritual practice. This book is I mean, to be honest, it's a direct product of my own um period of confusion, period of like trying to figure things out when I think we talked about this last time. I spent a lot of time in my life within Buddhist
Mm-hmm.
circles of practice, with sort of understanding things within Buddhist frameworks, in terms of personal practice, but then also had this scholarly background where, I had studied Asian traditions more generally from Hinduism, Taoism, a whole range of different practices and so forth. Always had a curiosity about how these fit together, an intellectual curiosity about how these were similar or different. But then when I started having these, direct experiences, like you said, things started happening to me. Um, there was a period of time where it really wasn't making sense. The Buddhist frameworks that I had were not fully capturing the whole picture for me. It wasn't a satisfactory kind of like framework for really explaining what was happening. And I found myself, because I also had a lifelong practice of yoga and I had a lot of different sort of practices that I'd been done. I found myself kind of piecing together a framework that tried to combine and reconcile these different Asian traditions together. And at a certain point, in my own experience, I started doing non-Asian practices, some shamanic practices and things like that as well. Um, and it was all just sort of piecemeal, but I felt like there was some cohesion to it, but I couldn't articulate it really at the time. And so anyway, this process went on for, a long time. And eventually, the process came to what I call in the book the release phase or the
Mm-hmm.
release process. And at that time, sort of everything kind of crystallized for me conceptually. So whereas I had struggled to understand things conceptually before, this model sort of arose that like, oh, this is how, in retrospect, this is how it all fit together. And so like a way of thinking about it sort of like materialized in my mind. And I felt that way of thinking was new and different. And what it required or what it inspired, I guess, was abandoning kind of like the central metaphor, the most common way of speaking about the awakening process. I needed to abandon that whole kind of like construct, and I kind of spontaneously discovered this whole other way of talking about awakening. And so that's what the book is about. The book is about, just presenting an alternative way of thinking about awakening that is different than the way that, 99.9% of people that I've ever heard
Mm-hmm.
talk about it, and different than the way all the traditions talk about it. And it's just like a completely like out of left field Here's a totally different way of talking that worked for me personally to make sense of what
Mm-hmm.
happened to me personally. And I'm putting it out there as like just an offering. If you like me, if you find yourself sort of confused about what's going on and feel like the existing maps, the existing kind of models of awakening are not really capturing your full experience, um, here's something to try and just try it on, conceptually. I'm not telling people how to practice. I'm not telling people what to do. It's just a framework or like a model. Try it on, see if this model works for you to help make sense of some of the things that are happening. And if it's helpful, then great. And if it's not helpful, then, carry on. Like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there's no claim that this is like ultimate truth or anything like that. It's just a new way of speaking. And so anyway, what I found was when I started speaking this way in certain groups of spiritual communities and so forth, when I started speaking this way, what I found was that a lot of people resonated with it and found it to be helpful. And then I found that, through their sharing with me, just kind of like, friends, personal acquaintances and so forth, started sort of sharing their own experiences. I found that it had a lot of explanatory power. Like this way of speaking was, confirmed by what people were telling me that this way of speaking holds up
Yep. Yep.
uh, among a broader range of people than just me, and that this way of speaking also proved to be helpful for people in many cases where previously they felt confused or felt like they weren't really sort of like, they were feeling disempowered. And this is something we can get into more. We talked about this with Lamp too. A lot of my work is about empowering people to sort of like
Mm-hmm.
trust themselves and
Mm-hmm.
have confidence in this process. So I think the model also proved to be helpful in that regard for a lot of people. And then one thing that we can also talk about if we want to get into it is specifically people who are having, what's normally called like a spiritual emergency, sort of like
Yep.
some really radically different, dramatically destabilizing kind of experience coming up that they really
Yep.
can't place and make sense of. Um, this model might help people to, just by reading this model, just to be like, oh, that's what's happening. Okay. And it just kind of like can, I'm not saying it always will, but it can, just that context can help people to navigate those difficult situations. Sometimes just like this, the difficulty evaporates because there's a map. It's on the map, right? This experience is on the map.
So this is to me a kind of a winning combination, because for me the winning combination is the direct experience combined with the knowledge that's rich, that's absolutely helpful. So what I love also that, while you're, because I think this is what I love that we have in common, the kind of allergy to any sort of ultimate truth about awakening, or the only ultimate or the only correct path to it, and so on. And at the same time, neither of us are saying, well, you should ditch traditions and you should ditch
Yeah.
this particular path or anything like that, because I completely appreciate the sort of whatever it's out there that helps people explain what's going on. Because for someone who came out of my journey, has unfolded without any knowledge of this process. And on the one hand, after my first awakening, which I didn't even consider first awakening, I didn't even consider the spiritual experience. To me, it was just a fundamental shift in perception that was so incredibly liberating. And after the so-called honeymoon period, which lasted for a very long time, nearly 3 years, I plunged into suffering like I never knew, before. And because I didn't have any frame of reference, I had no idea what was going on, other than I thought I was going crazy. I couldn't understand why I was going through this in the first place, given the profound insights that I had into the nature of reality, and self. So, you know, on the one hand, I can absolutely see how having had someone explain to me, hey, this is part of the process, and actually you're in the process of awakening, right? And this is what you can expect. Or just someone telling me, you're not, it's quite normal and you're not going crazy. That would have been helpful in and of
Yeah.
itself. And at the same time, after I've been through the shift and I started learning about the traditions and paths and models and started connecting the dots, it was so overwhelming and it was so complicated, the whole thing. I actually ended up being grateful that I was lost for so many years and had such a tough time than having had that knowledge, because I think it would be just I started seeing how the knowledge can be both illuminating and it can also be an obstacle. So can before we move on to
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
particular thread, can you actually talk a little bit about that? How much you're sort of emphasizing that maps are okay and helpful and have the place, but about forging one's own experience. Can we
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, a couple things coming to mind with what you were just saying, and one of them is that yeah, this is it. It's just a map. It's not actually a replacement for. It's not an attempt to replace traditions or the kinds of practices that are taught by traditions at all. It's a way. So if somebody is practicing, let's say in an Advaita context, a Buddhist context or whatever, and that those practices and those maps and those ways of thinking and those understandings are working for you, then there's absolutely no need to read this book. This book it's an alternative map for people who find that they're not fitting into the kind of traditional boxes, right? But it's not saying that those traditions are wrong and should not be practiced. It's not saying
Mm-hmm.
that at all. It's just providing like an umbrella theory or an umbrella model or map to help you navigate combining different practices together. That's it. So, or different traditions together. So, it's not saying throw out Buddhism and Advaita and Taoism. It's saying, well, if you're not fully fitting into Advaita, here's an idea about how you might approach combining Advaita practice with, something else from, I don't know, Taoism or from Christian mysticism or whatever. And here's a way that you might think about these two as working together, and incorporating both of them into your practice as opposed to trying to shove yourself into one or the other if it's not working for you, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's more like a meta level kind of umbrella model than a replacement for any of the individual traditions. And so the book has nothing to say really about. I'll give some suggestions on practice in the published book, but the version that's online has nothing to say about what you should practice because
Yeah.
essentially like practice what you're practicing. If you're doing Advaita practice, do that. If you're doing Buddhist practice, do that. If you want to explore, Qigong or shamanism or whatever, go ahead. I don't need to teach you how to do it. There's millions of teachers out there who, specialize in those different areas.
Mm-hmm.
What this model is doing is saying like, here's how they all might fit together. And then you can think about these different traditions instead of thinking about them as having all of the answers for you, which is usually the way they present themselves, right? Like you go to a teacher from any tradition and they're going to tell you like this is the ultimate truth and everything else is delusional and this is the one and only way, right? Blah blah blah. um Not always. I'm slightly exaggerating, but that's often
Only
often
slightly, Piers.
the yeah, only slightly, right? That's often the kind of the assumption. um, so what I'm saying is this model allows you instead to think about these different traditions, different teachers as being specialists in particular areas, right? And I like
Mm-hmm.
to say, like, when my wife's motorcycle breaks down, we don't call the plumber, right? When we have a plumbing
Yep.
problem, we don't call the electrician, right?
Yep.
There's like specialization in in there's specialization in knowledge, in practice, in techniques, like across all dimensions of human experience, right? And so I'm saying it's something similar is happening in spirituality, where you have like Christian mysticism really specializes in certain kinds of experiences. They're really good at understanding those, explaining those, provoking those, working with you to, work through those, deepen into those. And they're doing something completely different than what they're doing in Zen, right? And Zen, they're specializing in another area of the spiritual territory, and they're brilliant in that respect, right? And the Taoists are doing something different, and the Advaita and devotional Hinduism, these all have their
Yep.
own kind of like areas of expertise. And instead of like just, it's the same message as in Lamp Unto Yourself that we talked about in detail last time, but it's instead of adopting this as a total, ontology, philosophy, worldview that's going to explain everything, and I need to devote myself to this one kind of dogmatic tradition. Um, it's more of an exploratory kind of mentality, a sort of like piece it together yourself, empowering you to decide which components to pull together into a practice that's going to work for you and how you're configured personally.
Yeah, especially if someone is following a tradition and that particular tradition is actually not particularly interested in, say, exploring the energetic aspects of
Yeah,
the awakening journey, or the psych thread, which we're gonna get to hopefully finally. But then it's worth exploring, because you might be struggling with something and your tradition doesn't have an answer to this or doesn't
that's right.
include this, but it doesn't make it a wrong tradition. It just says it doesn't include it, but there's another one that does. So let's have a look.
That's
And
right.
all
So
yeah.
the problem is that many traditions, I don't want to, I don't want to say all of them, but a good number of them,
Mm-hmm.
when something arises that doesn't fit within their idea of what awakening is, when something arises that's different than what, their maps say you should expect, then the reaction is often from teachers within that tradition, the reaction is often to tell you that you're deluded, or that you've gone off track, or that this is meaningless and you should ignore it, or whatever, right? And so what winds up happening is a kind of a bypass, a kind of a spiritual bypassing, where like, it can be, deeply important, um, trauma work or shadow work, or that kind of stuff that comes up in the awakening process all the time. And you could be in a tradition that says all of that's just delusion, it's just egoic, like
Just a
whatever,
story, just
just a
whatever.
story.
Yeah,
To
yeah.
whom is that arising? Just move on, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Or it's just body sensations that are impermanent, or it's just whatever, right? And so, um, you know, a, the answer that you're getting from a tradition that doesn't really fully understand and recognize and value, and doesn't really have expertise in that particular area of awakening, the answers you're getting from them are as useful as my electrician telling me about the plumbing problem in my house. It's like, you
Yeah.
might be right, but like, you're not the expert. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I should get a specialist, right? Yeah. So it's just a way of kind of approaching this overarching, meta level thinking about how to navigate the spiritual territory. And yeah, one more thing, and then I'll stop answering that question. Is you're saying, you're distinguishing between kind of like conceptual, more theoretical, more modeling, and then just like direct experiencing. And this book is about conceptual modeling. That's what it's about. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's based on a lot of my own personal experience, and I talk in detail about phenomenology, like the stuff, like how it feels to be working through certain parts of the territory, what kinds of experiences you can have in those. And that's really just to point people to like, okay, here's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about these threads that
Yeah.
uh maybe we'll get into it in a minute, but like, just, there's phenomenological detail in there, that comes from direct experience, but that's not the point of the book. The point of the book is the theoretical model. So it's just like where this book is coming from. It's the need that I felt there was, or the I felt there was a need to have this new model, and so that's what this book is this new theoretical model.
It's absolutely brilliant. And I just wish you like didn't mention things that I want to obviously go into because I so we will never get to the actual thread. We will, I promise we will. But I really want to underline because you made such an important point, and this is based on the conversations that I've been having with so many people over the past few years. I've been seeing this so many times where someone has an experience, and I've been at the receiving end of this as well, where someone is describing their experience, and the other person, whether they're the teacher or just someone who basically talks about these things, will be dismissive, will dismiss that experience because it doesn't either fit like you said, the tradition, their model, but also sometimes not even their model, but just their experience. Just because they didn't experience it, they dismiss other person's experience because they simply don't recognize it. So I think to me that speaks to the maturity of a teacher specifically, because I think a brilliant teacher will never do this. They will, first of all, they will recognize where they are out of their depth, and they will recognize that they don't relate to an
Yeah.
experience, but they won't be dismissive of it. And I think that this is, they will recommend maybe someone who might be more familiar and send you to that person to have a conversation, but they will never invalidate or dismiss your experience. That's my not so humble opinion.
Yeah, so the written version of the book, the manuscript that's with the publisher, has um a little section which is like, how does this multidharma theory speak to me if I'm a teacher or a guide or a
Mm-hmm.
spiritual mentor of some kind? And I make exactly that point, and I say something like, in an ideal world, like if the multidharma model was actually adopted, by everybody, which of course it won't be, but imagine it was, spiritual teaching would be like a referral network of people who recognize their own specializations and then could see in their students, oh, you're having some of like that thread. I specialize in this thread. Let me refer you out to somebody who's going to be
Totally.
more helpful with that. And and we would get away from this kind of dogmatic thinking that, like, because this tradition worked for me and saw me all the way through, then this tradition is ontologically true, meaning like this is,
Yeah.
this is the
The
absolute
correct
truth.
way. Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's the only correct way of
yeah,
navigating, right, this
yeah,
territory. So we would get away from
yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a book should be written just on like the red flags around these topics, because like the other thing would have been not just not dismissing, which is a sign of maturity, but also like encouraging exploration,
Yeah.
or at least not discouraging, and certainly not shaming or guilt tripping people for wanting to explore different traditions or teachers
Absolutely.
and so on, right?
I mean,
So,
that's what we talked about last time, was just having to discover your own kind of configuration as a
yeah,
human being, as a mind body system, like where within the whole spiritual territory are you most at home, right?
yep,
I equate it to like an ecosystem, like the African savanna. They have hippos and they live in the swamp, and then you have giraffes that like eat from the trees, and then you've got like the whatever, the lions and the zebras and everybody else, and they each occupy kind of like a different niche. And it's like that, I think, for each of us with the spiritual territory, that we have a natural niche. We need to discover it for ourselves. We can't be told or forced into a niche that's not going to work for us. You can't send the giraffe to go live in the swamp with the hippo, right?
yep,
You have to let each person really figure out where they're going to thrive. And yeah, for me, that's like a fundamental um I don't know, starting point for both of these
yeah,
books. It's like just the fundamental kind of like point behind both of these books is that
yeah,
there's no one right way to do spirituality, and the right way is whatever's right for you, and that's going to be
Exactly. No, no,
that's yeah,
exactly that. Exactly that. And also, and not only that, this journey is so not linear and so rich that sometimes a particular tradition or model will totally work for a particular stage in the journey, but
for a
then
time.
it won't work for the next one. So you need something else. So then now that you know what's out there, you can go and explore and pick what is it that precisely you need for this point in the journey, right? And
That's
then you can move on to something else. So I think maybe that will be a sort of quote unquote elegant segue to the model that is the threads.
the threads. Yeah,
And yes,
yeah,
which is what your second book is about. So can you give us like a little
yeah,
snapshot of what threads are?
yeah. Because we've been talking in the abstract, so let's get down into the specifics. So
Yes,
okay, so I'm gonna start with a metaphor because I
please.
always think and speak and explain things with
In
metaphors,
metaphors,
better or
love
worse.
it.
That's just the way it comes
Yeah.
out. So it's kind of like imagine. Okay, so most people when they listen to music, they listen to like they listen to the structure of the song in terms of different parts, right? So like here's the verse and then here oh here's the chorus. This is my favorite part. And now here's the verse again. Here's the chorus, right? Here's a bridge, here's a chorus, right? You're following it sort of like in chunks, right? Um or you could listen to the same piece of music by following one instrument throughout the whole piece. It's a different way. Most people don't listen to, I think musicians do, but most non-musicians don't listen to music in that way. Like I'm just going to listen to what the bass line is doing throughout the whole song. And then I'm going to rewind it and now I'm going to listen to the just what the trumpet is doing for the whole song. Now I'm going to rewind it and listen to the drum, what that's doing for the whole song, right? And so it's just like a different, it's the same piece of music. It's just a different way of slicing it or a different way of like tracking it or talking about it. So something like that is what I'm doing in this book. And so what I'm saying is that the way that almost every kind of model of awakening that I know of. So like all the Buddhist models, all the Hindu models, the Christian kind of like contemplative models, people like Saint John of the Cross and folks like that. All of the models that I'm aware of that people are talking about in contemporary spirituality as well, new models that people have created, they always are looking at things in terms of stages of
Mm-hmm.
awakening, that you have this like initial stage and then you have this other stage and then you deepen and now you're in this stage and then you get to that stage, right? So these are called different things in different traditions. They're called bhumis in Buddhism. They're called, whatever, stages of insight in Theravada. They're called ox herding pictures in Zen. They have different names in all these traditions and they slice it up differently. They talk about different stages. They describe them differently. But everybody's talking about stages, stage one, two, three, four, five, six, etc., however many, in order to become like fully enlightened or awakened or whatever the story is at the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm saying, well, you know, let's talk about it in a different way. Let's like slice this territory in a completely different way. And similar to like following one instrument throughout the whole song, what I'm suggesting is that an awakening process, regardless of stages, that there are certain threads that run through the whole process from beginning to end, and that it's the same territory. It's the same song. I'm not saying that the stages don't exist. I'm not saying you should ignore the stages or forget about them or whatever. I'm just saying let me just only talk about it from this new way of talking. Whatever tradition you're in with all the stages and so forth, you continue to follow that, no problem. If it works for you, great. But like, let me just point out that there are these threads potentially that run through the whole awakening process, and see what you think or how it kind of reframes things if you listen to these instruments individually instead of worrying about am I in a verse or a chorus or verse number two or whatever. So what are these threads? I call these are threads, and now I'm going to shift metaphors because now it's no longer music. Now it's
Go for it.
threads, right? So like imagine you're like, knitting or sewing something and you've got threads, right? So that's the metaphor of the book. These are the threads of awakening. So the idea is that there are, who knows, you could probably do this much more kind of like nuanced and come up with like 1,000 threads. But for me, I think it's helpful to kind of identify four main threads that potentially can run through an awakening process. And I'm not saying everybody's going to experience all four. You might be a 2-thread person. I'm a 4-thread person. Somebody else might be a 3-thread person. Like, that's something that we can see. We can appreciate the diversity of different people's experiences. Some people might have a fatter thread or a thinner thread. For you, one thread might be really, really prominent. For me, it's less so. It's both. For both of us, it's running throughout our process. But for you, it's a big deal. For me, it's more of a minor thing, right? Just like some songs have more guitar in
Mm-hmm.
them than others. And then we can say that some of these threads are more aligned with certain traditions than others. Like certain traditions specialize in one threads versus in others. Okay, so what are the four threads? The four threads are the four spiritual threads, because there's actually a fifth one that I'll mention in a sec. But the four spiritual threads are, I call them emptiness, which is a word that I'm using to refer to kind of like the seeing through things, the kind of the collapsing of concepts and experiences, the um, the reduction or the breaking through of the consolidated and kind of uh, conceptual, so the consolidated and like real seeming, what I call the reified nature of
Mm-hmm.
concepts, seeing through those, having those collapse, having those fall away. That I call that the emptiness thread. And this is the specialty of Advaita and a lot of forms of Buddhist meditation, right? Those you're seeing through the illusion of the self, of time, of space, of all kinds of concepts. And you're doing that either through meditation or through inquiry. Like techniques don't really matter, but I mean, you practice whatever techniques you want, but the point is that this thread moves towards more and more emptied out experience, more and more like stillness, void, cessation, blank, blackness, just kind of like everything kind of like fading out and having those kinds of experiences. I'm summarizing that really quickly just to move on. The second thread is what I call the oneness thread, and this is the kinds of experiences that are more valued in Christian mysticism and Sufism, in many forms of Hinduism other than Advaita, Mahayana Buddhism, and other traditions that really value, instead of an emptying out of everything, it's a connection, an intimacy, a wholeness, a oneness, a melting into everything, a seeing everything as being part of a unified field or entity. Like instead of losing yourself because the self is a concept that you see through, it's losing the separate self because you've melted into the whole, right? So it
Mm-hmm.
is it is also non-dual, it is also non-self, but it's moving in a different direction than the emptiness thread. A lot of like, so
Right.
the emptiness thread and the emotions kind of disappear, right? A
Mm-hmm.
lot the
Mm-hmm.
emotions are just sort of seen as being another kind of thing that's arising that is seen through, that is, reified. But in the oneness thread, there can be a lot of like emotional, like love and intimacy and connection and compassion and devotion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it can be like, unity, this unity experience with God. It can be very like deified, or it can be just like the universe, or like all,
Love
all.
with capital L, sort of.
Yeah, everything is
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
love.
yeah,
Every
yeah.
if you're saying everything is blah blah blah, whatever that blah 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 is, um if it's not like everything is gone, or everything is
Yes.
empty, or everything is absent, or
Yes.
everything is not arising, because that would be
Something,
emptiness thread.
either way.
But if everything is something, that's a oneness thread, right? But whatever the
Right.
something is,
Yeah, yeah.
right? That's
Brilliant. Mm-hmm.
oneness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So okay, and then the next thread is energy, energetic type things. Now I'm it's important to distinguish. I am not talking about like going and getting acupuncture, because that's not awakening, right? That's healing.
Mm,
That's a different thing. Acupuncture, Reiki, etc. Like,
yep.
um, using energy to heal is great, but it's not what I'm talking about here. Here I'm talking about awakening experiences, right? Awakening to, the collapse of the self and awakening to the full um ultimate reality that everything is this energetic kind of potentiality that's kind of buzzing in and out of existence in this rapid fire, like gone before it arises, sort of like energetic pulsation. So this is kind of like the specialty of certain forms of Taoism, Kundalini, experiences within the yogic, tantric kind of family. Tibetan Buddhism is part of that as well. So there are traditions that like specialize in working with energies and really kind of like maximizing these sorts of experiences through various
Mm-hmm.
techniques and so forth. Um, Again, it's equally non-dual because you get to the point where it's like, you know, you can't say if everything is empty or not empty because it's just all sort of like gone before it arises. It's all just kind of like potential, right? So it's sort of like another form of non-duality. and then
Mm-hmm.
and then then we get to the fourth spiritual thread, and this one is the one that is the most different in the way that I talk about it than because I'm combining together with this thread some really radically different things that use very different language, and conceptualize things differently, but I'm gonna bring them together under this title of what I call the psyche thread. And so
Mm-hmm.
the psyche thread is all of the kinds of awakening experiences where the realization is that reality and experience are being completely constructed by some kind of previously unconscious mental or psyche kind of unconscious layers of reality that previously were not seen, that emerge to the forefront, that are seen and understood to be the actual underlying reality. So this could be anything, but some common examples are realizing, and it's also non-dual. The self collapses and everything becomes this. And so it's a realization, for example, that I thought I was me, but actually everything that I think of as me is actually conditioning just running automatically, psychological, programming that's running automatically. And there is no I here because it's all just sort of autonomous. That's one. Another example might be, there is no I here. There's just like these, um, like different kinds of like spiritual entities, like I thought I was me, but actually it turns out I'm a being from another dimension that's here on earth with this mission that I'm just realizing I have now, that I've been working on for lifetimes, and now this is the latest kind of like chapter in this story, of this multi-galactic kind of story. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
people who have
Mm-hmm.
that kind of experience, and
Yeah.
then like shamanic kind of experiences, like, oh, I thought I was me, but actually there's just all of these different spirits that are inhabiting this body and this mind that are all sort of like working out their own agendas and their own kind of their own patterns and so forth. And I thought I was Piers, but actually I'm these combination of these spirits or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you could have a similar experience with like certain forms of Jungian psychology, IFS, other kinds of forms of contemporary psychological models and so forth that talk about, I thought I was pierced, but actually it's the collective unconscious, or it's the, the various parts that they have in IFS, or it's, some other kind of like aspects, unconscious aspects of the psyche that turn out to be what's actually ultimately real. And so this is a complicated one because of all these differences between these different traditions. But what I want to do is say that that is a thread that runs through an awakening process as well for many people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then, so those are the four spiritual threads. And then the
Yep.
fifth thread is the ordinary life. Like this is like the quote unquote non-spiritual kind of stuff. Just, going to work, taking care of kids, feeding the dogs, driving a car, all that kind of stuff. And as part of that, Pierce is a human being who's got a, physical body and has to
And a
eat,
job.
and yeah, and a job and
Uh-huh.
responsibilities, and there's a physical body, and there's basic kinds of egoic functions that need to take place. Like I need to be able to respond when somebody calls my name, and I need to be able to, like, show up and play my roles in society or whatever. So that's the kind of the daily, what I call the daily life thread.
Mm-hmm.
um and the idea, just to kind of like paint the whole picture really quickly, is that an awakening process begins with these different threads kind of like coming online. And it can often be messy and often be confusing. And there often can be this kind of like oscillation between these threads. Like now I'm God, and now everything's empty, and now I'm just Pierce, and now I'm like, now my trauma is really like, driving everything that I'm thinking and doing, and now it's just energy. And it can be, not everybody has all four or five of these threads active, but it can be very like disorienting, discombobulating. How does all this fit together? Like I'm confused, this is difficult, right? A lot of people have that for a long time. But
Yep.
eventually, as you continue to like deepen down into the threads, as you continue to move through the awakening process, the threads will start, they're at first they're doing what I call it braiding together, right? So like one's on top for a while, and then now this one's on top for a while, and now this one's on top for a while. And it's sort of like they're obscuring each other. They're kind of like oscillating between them. But eventually over time, they start to blend together, integrate together. More and more integration takes place. Eventually, all of five of these threads turn out to be totally integrated, so that it's like, oh, these are all just aspects of the same thing. Like I can, speaking from, I'm sort of fast forwarding a lot, but speaking from a very integrated kind of place, you would say something like, I am experiencing myself, I'm experiencing the universe, I'm experiencing reality as simultaneously totally empty, completely one and divine and sacred and love, permeating everything, and also completely energetic, and also completely a construct of my own unconscious mind, and also just an ordinary, you know, um, just ordinary life. I'm also just Pierce going to work, right? And all of it is fully integrated, synthesized together. So there's actually, those are all just like different facets of the same exact thing, and
There's no contradiction.
there's no contradiction.
There's no
Exactly.
paradox. I call it
No.
like a
So it goes
death of
from being
paradox.
it goes
Yeah.
from being oscillating back and forth to
Yeah.
being like, oh wow, these are two sides of the same coin, which they're paradoxical. How could they both be true? That's so interesting and weird. And then there's a sort of like, oh, of course, obviously they're all the same thing, and they
Mm.
could, how could I have ever thought that they were
Mm.
actually different things?
Yeah.
And so the threads, right? They're originally separate. They braid together in sort of like oscillation, and then they integrate together, kind of becoming one thing. And then at the very end of my model is where, like after the whole process of integration takes place, then the whole project kind of can be dropped. The whole, all the threads can be dropped. Spirituality can be dropped.
Awakening.
Spiritual experiences, awakening goes away. And it's
Yeah.
just like, oh, what was that? All of that
Yeah.
turns out to have been kind of like a process that has finished and is no longer relevant.
Yep.
And so I call that the release of the threads. And so um, I want to just reiterate one thing and then I'll turn it over to you is these are not stages. It's not like first there's opening, then there's braiding, then there's integration, and then there's dropping, because that would just turn it back into a 5-stage model or whatever.
Yep.
It would turn back into what I'm saying I'm trying to get away from. So it's not that. It's process the whole way through, just like tracking the individual threads, running through the whole process and seeing how the thread goes from opening to deepening to becoming more integrated to being dropped, right? And each thread has that sort of trajectory and you can track it going through. And so when you're in the middle of an awakening process and things are really confusing, why is it like all this trauma is coming up? Well, here's that thread coming to the surface. And
Yep.
I remember this happened before. I oscillated away from this. Now this thread is coming back. Let me pick back up where I left off before and deepen it down into this thread. It's now time for me to shift my practices maybe and orient towards the thread that's here at the moment, right? So yesterday I was doing all this super deep, meditation or whatever, but today it's about trauma.
I need to attend to my trauma or my
And that's
wounds
what,
or my
yeah,
nervous system or yeah.
exactly. And then next week, yeah, some kind of kundalini thing happens, and oh, now it's about energy, and now I need to really attend to that, right? And so how you do that is up to you. Some traditions give you multiple tools for different threads, like the yoga tradition, the classical kind of like Patanjali yoga tradition has both tools for emptiness and energy. Great.
Mm-hmm.
Mahayana Buddhism has tools for both emptiness and compassion. Great. Some traditions are more single thread, like Zen and Advaita, are like all about emptiness and not about a whole lot more. So, okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you need like therapy, or you need to go to the gym, or you need to like take some vitamins, or you need to like go to the doctor, and that's just daily life stuff. And sometimes that's what you need to do, right? Um, so each one of these threads can you can find resources and specialists from the threads that will help you in the moment with whatever whatever thread is on the surface at the moment. And these practices don't have to be seen, or these kind of oscillations don't have to be seen as a problem. It's just it's this
Exactly.
braiding process that's happening. And you just keep working, keep going down the threads, keep working with them, keep digging into them through whatever techniques are working, whatever techniques you have access to, whatever techniques are best for what you're dealing with right at the moment. And if you continue to do that, they will continue to deepen and deepen and eventually start to integrate and smooth out, and you'll get to the bottom of all of them. But if you're there kind of like resisting what's happening in the moment, right? I shouldn't be feeling like this because yesterday or a week ago I wasn't, or like I shouldn't be feeling like this because my teacher told me I shouldn't, or whatever. If you're like resisting those oscillations and wanting to like shove yourself into a different kind of model, or denying what's on the surface, right? Then you're not helping this braiding process move towards integration. You're just kind of like resisting the process. Okay, so that's like the summary of the whole thing.
Oh,
So,
so, well, you did a brilliant job. And to do it in a nutshell, again, always a concept I am alien to. So, yeah.
mm.
Um,
And there's a lot more
but-
detail in the on the website. So people, if they want to
yeah,
like really geek out about it, there's 55 pages, I think it is, that's up online. So go take a look there. But yeah, that's
right.
the model in a nutshell.
So I absolutely encourage. I will obviously leave the links, and you can not only check the website and read it for yourself, but Piers also did other interviews and had other conversations where he covers those threads. So I highly encourage you to watch it. But today we decided we're just gonna focus on the psych thread. And again, one of the reasons why I mentioned my own experience where I was kind of lost after that now I know it was like the first awakening was precisely that. It was like oscillating for years between, sort of formless and form, but neither here nor there. And the nowhere was really terrifying. And I had no idea what was going on. But the one thing that I think so many people at least told me that they related to when I shared this was that I was at that point of like everything is just a story. It's just a thought, right? So stuff started coming up to the surface on a very profoundly visceral, emotional level. And all I kept on, and I had this one thought that would like be like on a loop. This should not be happening. This should not be happening. This should not be happening. And little did I know that this one little thought just really held the key to why I was still suffering. And also, the other thing that was happening was now the mind has sort of hijacked what was a genuine, profound, permanent shift and insight into what I call a shield. So every time there was discomfort coming up to the surface, I would be like, it's just a thought. It's just a thought. So it literally, it's just a thought or it's just an illusion became like a mantra that I used to shield myself from the discomfort that I was experiencing. And honestly, the reason why I'm talking about this, because I think it really relates to the psych thread
Yeah,
in that,
yeah, absolutely.
you know, I, I was such an asshole as well during this time because I was in this peculiar place where I was really suffering, but I was like feeling like I was above everyone else in some way because I knew that it was just an illusion, it was just a thought. And so even when people were asking me how I was doing when I was really struggling, I would say I was okay because I was responding from knowing that I was fundamentally okay, even though I was totally freaking falling apart and totally suffering in silence. And so basically the result of that was that I was gradually being more and more cut off from my body. And I was becoming increasingly numb because I was not able to be with what was resurfacing at all. So I was then, so even my connections were affected by that because I was not only not able, me, the normally compassionate, naturally kind of friendly, helpful person, all of a sudden I became more and more distant because I was not able to be with the discomfort in me that was coming up to the surface. I certainly wasn't able to be with the discomfort arising in other people. So I think that this is no matter we're different journeys, but I've known so many people who have gone through this. And so can you speak to what is going on at
Yeah,
this point?
that you just gave a brilliant description of what I was talking about kind of in the abstract about at some point in this braiding process, this oscillating between the different threads, at some point a thread comes to the foreground and everything else becomes background or everything else kind of like recedes because this thing is now on top, right? So what you just described was brilliant. You had this, emptiness, like deeper emptiness kind of experiences where you could see through concepts, you could see, things are just stories. That's an emptying out. And then you talked about this compassion, this kind of love, this sort of like, that's more for me, that's more of like a oneness thread kind of experience, and that you had experiences with that, but now with the psyche thread coming on top, right? These things that you're being asked to look at are obscuring or displacing the other threads. The other threads recede to the background, right? So you're like, I can't find the compassion anymore. I'm not finding I'm not finding the
Zero.
right. I'm not able to like see through this. So because this psyche thread is on top now. But what you also described was like resistance to the fact that the psyche thread is on top, not wanting to deal with it and trying to escape into emptiness to make it go away. Oh, that's just a story. That's just a story. That's just a story, right? Somebody else would try to escape into oneness to get rid of that. Like, oh yeah, but that's all, what makes me a loving person and is what makes me connected with the universe and so on and so forth, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they would try to like absorb the trauma into their like oneness story, as a way of like deflecting it, right? And but both, whether you're doing it with emptiness or doing it with oneness, or you do it with energy. Oh, this is just something that needs to be cleared from my system. I need to just create a boundary around me so I won't be disturbed by these, negative energies, right? That's a way of kind of deflecting it from the energy thread perspective. All of these are just ways of deflecting, right? Whereas what the psyche thread is asking you to do is to, look at how constructed your experience is and how your experience is being shaped by this unconscious process that's now arising to the surface. And what you articulated there, which is a really important insight that I think the psyche thread brings us at some point, is, oh, I thought I was awakening, but it turns out this whole awakening thing is just a way of deflecting from reality. It's just this whole awakening thing is actually just a way of escaping my pain, right? Like that's
It's
a realization. That's
unbelievable.
an
Yeah.
important, a
Yeah.
very important milestone on the psyche thread that I think at some point anybody in a psyche thread awakening process is going to learn. Oh, I thought I was awakened. But actually, this whole thing turns out to just be unconscious projection.
Yeah.
Um, and that is an insight. That is the like a very central insight on the psyche thread, and actually grappling with that, actually realizing that your whole awakening thing is just an escape mechanism, um, is its own kind of awakening. That's what I want to say about the psyche thread. Is it's just like energy awakening is not acupuncture or Reiki, so psyche thread is not just healing. It's not healing from your traumas. It's not that. That is great. People should do it, just like people should do acupuncture, but that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about when I talk about the energy thread is it's an awakening to the fact that everything's energy. So in the psyche thread, it's an awakening to the fact that everything's a projection. Everything I've been thinking was real is actually turns
Yep.
out to just be a projection of my unconscious. And so my awakening is too. Like the whole idea of awakening is my own projection. So
Yep.
I'm talking about a relatively deep insight on the psyche thread. You might have to have like other insights first before you get to that realization, but ultimately that realization comes somewhere on the psyche thread, is like, oh, this whole thing is just a concoction. It's a something I've dreamed up in order to protect myself from actually experiencing reality. From actually, just being raw and naked in the world. I have to like shield myself with this whole awakening thing, in order to be safe or in order to be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a very important milestone in the psyche thread.
How would you, what would you say to people who are sort of um, doing what I've just described, but are not necessarily aware, and now they're hearing our conversation? And what would you say are the sort of things to look at that you are experiencing to
Yeah.
that will tell you? Because a lot of what I was like, I had no idea that I was in constant state of resistance. I had no idea. I've only saw that 10 years later in
That's right.
retrospect,
Yeah.
going
Of
through
course.
a lot of dark nights and a lot of just waves of terror and all these kind of dark territories. So
Yeah.
so again, talking about your book, it's so brilliant to have some clues, because we can the levels to which we can delude ourselves that we already got it, that we already arrived, and are endless. So and that there's nothing to do anymore, and that sort of thing. So can you talk what some of those clues would have been?
Yeah. Fantastic. So yeah, this is great. So for all of the threads, right, it's possible that you might be in a practice tradition that is pointing you in that direction already, right? So for all of the threads, like if you're in a practice tradition that knows where the thread is going, they're probably telling you that from the beginning. So like if you're, I spent a lot of time in Buddhist circles, but Buddhism, Advaita, etc., like emptiness thread kind of practices, they're going to be telling you from the beginning, like, don't get hung up on anything because everything's just a story, everything's just, just a concept, etc. They're telling you that from the beginning. And so as you're going down the thread, you kind of like are oriented towards seeing that everything is a concept, right?
Yep.
In down the oneness thread, they're telling you everything is one, everything is God, everything is the universe, right? They're telling you that all along. So all along you're kind of attuning to that. And whenever you find something that's not God, you know from your tradition that this too is God, but you just haven't seen it yet. So you need to like kind of like orient towards seeing this also as being part of the one, right? Same with energy, right? Anything that seems solid, if you're in an energy based tradition, anything that seems solid seems like a blockage, seems like a non-dynamic or static kind of thing. You're being told by your tradition this too is energy. You just haven't seen it as such yet, and so you orient that way. Same with the psyche thread. If you're in a tradition that is telling you clearly, absolutely every part of your experience is a projection of your unconscious. If they're telling
Mm-hmm.
you that clearly, then as you're going through, every time you think, oh, now I got it. Now I'm enlightened. Now I have my stability. Now I have the truth, right? You know from your tradition that this is a projection too. You just haven't seen it that way. You need to kind of like orient towards it, see that it's also a projection, see that it's also, your safety mechanism or your escape mechanism or whatever, and see it that way. So if you're in a tradition that's skillfully guiding you
Mm-hmm.
in that way all along, then you might have techniques, you might have teachings, you might have messaging from your spiritual guides, mentors, whoever, towards that. The problem is if you're not in a tradition and you're kind of like doing this DIY thing, or you're having experiences that are
I
happening.
don't recommend.
Yeah, you're having experiences that are out of the blue that you don't know what to do with, and you don't know to look at these things in these ways, right? Then you can get stuck on one of these things for a very long time. So people
Yep.
have these like spontaneous Kundalini awakenings, and suddenly they're in some kind of like, profound kind of blockage and physical discomfort and so on and so forth for decades, because
Mm-hmm.
they don't have the framing, the guidance within the tradition for really navigating that properly. Same thing, you beat your head against the wall in meditation for or in oneness or whatever for years, for decades, if you don't have proper guidance. Same thing in psyche. You can just get lost in this stuff thinking, that you're you know, thinking you're the Buddha or Jesus or whatever,
Yeah.
if you don't have the proper guidance. So what I talk about in the book is I give people what I call guiding questions. And these are sort of, it's what I just went through for each one of the threads. And this is like, if you're trying to do this yourself, like orient towards this for each one of the threads. And how you orient, is it meditation? Is it reflection? Is it just kind of like
Inquiry or yeah.
inquiry? Is it just kind of sitting and sinking into it
Yeah.
somatically? Like totally up to you. I'm not going to prescribe how you do it, but for each one of the threads, just orient in a particular kind of way towards your experience, and it'll help to kind of like keep you moving deeper down the thread. So in the emptiness thread, basically it's like, what seems real right now? And if something seems real,
Mm-hmm.
go investigate that and see if it actually is
Yeah.
real. Right?
Yeah.
So you can do this, all concepts can be seen through with just that one guiding question. You can go all the way down to the emptiness, all the way down the emptiness thread, just seeing through everything. If you're just continuously like, well, what seems real now? Oh, perception, vision seems real. Let me investigate. Is that actually there?
Mm-hmm.
Body sensations seem real. Is that true? experience seems real. Is that actually true? You know, you can like deconstruct all of these things and go all the way down to emptiness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, on the oneness thread, you can orient towards the question of, does anything seem separate from the one, right? And that, if it does, if it seems separate from the one, then go lean into that, sink into that, investigate that. Is it actually true? Oh, I think there are different objects in my, that I can perceive. Is that true? Go see. I feel like I'm separate from God. Is that true? Go see. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like there's like, the universe, and then there's like an observer of the universe. Is that true? Go see. And just the kind of like leaning into that will lead you all the way down to the complete and total oneness. Energy, it's like the guiding question is, what seems solid? What seems non-dynamic? What seems to be actually like, um, even for like a second, even for like a nanosecond, what actually seems to materialize? What actually seems to be, stable for any amount of time? Is it actually so? Well, I feel like I have a pain in my back. Do you? Go see. Well, I feel like this phone is a solid object. Is it? Go investigate. I feel like the universe is flashing in and out in like um, nanosecond by nanosecond, but each one of those little flashes is like a particle that's seems solid. Go see if it's actually solid, right? Like no matter what scale, like go see.
Mm-hmm.
True.
Mm-hmm.
Lean into it. Is it true? So Psyche, because that was your original question,
Yep.
the Psyche thread. The guiding question is, what seems to be not constructed, what seems to be not part of this, unconscious projection of my mind, what seems to not be just an unconscious projection of my fantasies and my desires and my wishes.
Like,
Um,
what do I think should not be happening?
what do I think should not be happening? What am I not welcoming
Mm-hmm.
into the experience? What am I thinking is like not something that I'm doing myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it can be like really gross things like this trauma. This trauma is like oppressing me. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's seems like this thing that happened to me or is happening to me, right? Is that true? Go see. Um, this feeling that I actually, I'm an awakened person. Is that feeling, is that thought, is that kind of like reality? Is that actually true, or is it a projection of your unconscious?
Mm-hmm.
Go go see. Um, you know, at, okay, well, at least like I know that this visual perception, this red color that's here, I know that's actually not a a projection. That's something that's actually like there and and
Mm-hmm.
and 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 indicative of like reality outside of my own projection. If you think that, go see. Go look at it. Go see if you can perceive that red separately from your own conditioning, separately from your own um, unconscious processes of your psyche. So just
Yeah.
like lean into whatever you are perceiving as not being a projection.
Part of this, or part of,
Just
yeah.
yeah, lean into it. And so what you'll discover, and this is maybe I should have said this before, but the what you'll discover is what the psyche thread leads you to discover is deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper layers of conditioning that's producing constructions, right? So, these layers, like, you can see some people see all of them, some people see like most of them. You can move through them more quickly or more slowly, depending on what, what, your own configuration, your own past, your own skills, your own whatever. But I'm talking not just about like personal history, personal trauma. So that's
Mm-hmm.
an important
Yep.
source of conditioning,
Absolutely.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Very important source of conditioning is
Yep.
your personal story, what happened to you since you were
Yep.
born.
The beliefs that stemmed out of that and
Yeah, but the
interpretations and
beliefs,
so
the
on. Yep.
interpretations, the habits,
Yep.
the ways of thinking, the
Yep.
way the ordinary what feels normal, all of that is like produced by your life since you were born.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Of course, we know about now like birth and prenatal trauma and prenatal experiences and how that can influence, you know, things like your thoughts, your emotions, the way that you relate to other people, and so forth. Um, w so I'm just sticking within like strictly kind of like modern kinds of ways of knowing.
Yes.
We also know about intergenerational traumas being a real thing. We
Mm-hmm.
know about genetics, hereditary genetics. We know about uh, hormones and chemistry in your body, right? Like I have certain ways of seeing the world because my body is male, and that is constructing and construing how I relate with what seems to be objective reality. Like, oh, this is just, reality. But actually, my male hormones are constructing that experience in a particular way that's different than somebody who
Yep.
doesn't have male hormones. I'm constructing things differently because of, my gut microbiome or other kinds of aspects of this physical entity that is producing a reality for me that's different than for other people. You could go even deeper, and I'm still just in the like kind of modern Western knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I, my vision works in a certain way, and back to that red color there, my vision works in a certain way because I have human eyes. And if I had dog's eyes or bear's eyes or fish eyes or shrimp eyes or some other kind of eyes, I don't think I'd see that color the same way, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's like it's down to like species like just the fact that I'm human is constructing my whole world, right? The whole world is being constructed in my brain differently than in my dog's brain, right? And I'm just thinking that it's all real and all just like the way it is, but it's actually just all a construct. It's all like a
Mm-hmm.
virtual reality construct being produced by this kind of brain from a Western kind of scientific kind of viewpoint. Um, so then what about culture? So my reality, my way of being is entirely in many ways constructed around my heritage, my ancestral heritage, right? The fact that I grew up in South America, the fact that I, live in the United States, the fact that I've been exposed to certain kinds of cultural and social dynamics and not others, the fact that, whatever, like all of those things are also conditioning.
Yep.
Um, and then we can get into more esoteric type of conditioning that may or may not apply. Different people might believe this or not, but there's other kinds of conditioning, that sort of ways that people talk about conditioning. So there's like, past life conditioning,
Mm-hmm.
there's karma
Mm-hmm.
conditioning, there's what my destiny is or what God's plan is for me. There's like what the planets and the stars are doing. There's like, there's
The
a million.
galactic stuff and the
Sure, and
ascensions and
astronomy, and
all that.
yeah, there's a million
Yeah.
other things, and and this is why Psyche thread is like very different from tradition to tradition. Different people experience differently, because for me it might be absolutely real that I'm being shaped by these animal spirits that like live in my body. And for you, it might be absolutely real that you have these past lives. And for somebody else, it might be absolutely real that they're an astral being that has this kind of other conditioning, right? There's
Yep.
all these kinds of different ways of conceiving of it. But the point, just the bottom line, no matter how you're conceiving of the psyche thread, the bottom line is that conditioning goes all the way down. There is no experience whatsoever that you can have that's not conditioned by one or more of those levels.
Yeah.
right? There's no even like, oh, I finally had this big awakening and now I can see reality as it is. Can you? Can you see reality as it is with these human eyes that are not fish eyes? Can you see reality as it is with this male, you know, body with this certain age with certain kinds of hormones? Are you seeing reality as it is with this mammalian chemistry, or are you seeing a construct?
Yeah.
And the wisdom of the psyche thread is to just constantly attune to, oh, this appears to be real, but it's actually just a construct. And in what ways is this constructed? And in what ways is this a projection of it could be a projection of my fantasies. It could be a construct of my human eyeballs. It could be a construct of the fact that I'm male, you know, all the way down. And the psyche thread, that's so all of these threads, they wind up in the place of non-duality, where everything is seen to be, you know, um, non non-dual, non-separate.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the psyche thread, the psyche thread's non-duality is, it seems, so the psyche thread's duality seems like, oh, there's me and my conditioning
Right.
my conditioning
Yes.
gets in the way of me seeing reality. My conditioning is getting in the way of my awakening. My conditioning is getting in the way of me being the way that I really should be. But actually, so that's the duality. And you get down to the bottom, it's like, oh, everything was conditioning all along. Like even the idea that I could get out of conditioning was a conditioning.
Right.
My dog doesn't think that it can get out of conditioning. That's a human thing, right? So it's
Hmm.
it's also conditioning,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I think it's a brilliant segue. Thank you. For my next question,
Okay.
which is, um, well, before I actually come to the question, I want to go back to the story I shared because I think it's sort of related because that was one of the traps of that stage in the journey where because of that powerful insight and everything is just a story and illusion, blah, blah, blah. I was literally above things like trauma and wounds, peers. I was
Sure.
above it
Yeah.
all, like it didn't concern me. Like for some reason, I was different from all the other human beings on this planet that somehow that stuff didn't concern me and therefore I didn't have to look at it. And so I was actually literally laughing at people in a kind of subdued way, not like completely openly, of like how they're digging into these stories and dwelling in the past and just getting lost in that and like none of that matter and everything. So the reason why I'm mentioning it because that's precisely what I ate massive humble pie. I would say not one, but multiple when it comes to that, because every other shift that happened after that was almost like a what I call spiritual colonic, basically bringing up to the surface more stuff. So
Love the
actually,
metaphor. Yeah.
right? So in many, the reason why I use colonic because it's not necessarily pleasant, and it was never pleasant. So it was almost like this is maybe goes to that bit that we talk about the when you think you arrive, that's probably the clue. That would be one of the clues to think that you definitely haven't, because it can feel like that. But like every shift brings with it a sort of a different batch, the next batch of things. Very often, at least that's been the case in my experience and that of many others that I spoke to. But one of the things that was such a massive part of this journey for me that came with another shift was seeing that conditioned self was not separate from anything else. Like there was no, like it was not only not pushed away at that point, it was completely like embraced and merged as part of this. So pushing any of that stuff away just didn't make sense anymore, which brings me to this. You said in your book that doesn't exist yet on the website. In my personal opinion, such phenomena are not often dealt with skillfully in pre-modern religions. In most traditional forms of Buddhism, for example, the whole range of unconscious materials is lumped together as defilements or karmic traces, and these are talked about as things that simply need to be purified. I think there are more skillful ways of navigating these waters in Tibetan traditions with practices such as dream yoga and dark retreat, but these can be extremely intense and typically require initiation. In my view, there are more accessible and equally helpful range of approaches to be found in psychotherapy, Jungian-inspired active imagination and shadow work, and various forms of shamanism, paganism, and other indigenous traditions. So I have two questions.
Mhm.
Question number one is, why on earth is this pushed away? Like, why is this almost to the point of being pathologized or demonized, which I sort of discovered later on. And the other question is, how then, what are some of the traps of how bypassing then happens within those various avenues, because
Yeah.
or traditions, because I think that different tradition will have a different, its own type of bypassing that happens, which might even not feel like bypassing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Great. Um, So I just want to mark first before I start answering the question that what you talked about at the first part of what you were saying is an indication of what it looks like to go from braiding to integration. So
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the psyche thread, previously you were saying the site, this stuff's coming up and I'm like denying it and deflecting from it, trying to like escape into emptiness in order to avoid it, and so on and so forth. And then what you said was gradually there became like this accepting of the conditioning, the conditioned self, and then a seeing that it's actually part of the whole and not separate from the awakening. And it's just all sort of like, different facets of the same thing. That is the integration of the psyche thread, what that looks like, right? And then and so all the threads have this kind of like braiding phase, and then they lead to an integration phase where they become incorporated into the whole. Um,
Right.
so 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 that being said, then we can look at what traditions say about the site, this material that I'm talking about, and we can look at them whether they are accepting the psyche thread as part of the awakening process and including it in the integration
Mm-hmm.
or not. And so the majority of Asian and Asian inspired traditions tend to dismiss the psyche thread awakening as a real thing. It has to do with the history of philosophy and history of religions in those cultures, particularly in Indian culture. Um, and so you have and also it has to do with the fact that these are pre-modern traditions. They didn't have the notion barely existed. It's you can maybe kind of like find it in a couple of places in pre-modern history, but the notion of like the unconscious mind, I mean that's really an kind of a discovery, you
Yep.
could say, of Western psychology,
Mm-hmm.
right? In the way that we talk about it today as being like unconscious conditioning, unconscious materials, the way that trauma is like latent and then can come forward and be when it's triggered, and all of those ways of talking are modern Western ways of talking. And in kind of pre-modern Asian traditions, you often have a more dismissive viewpoint of this material as being sort of like these are the kleshas or the delusions or the veils that are hiding the ultimate truth. And in these traditions, the ultimate truth is often emptiness or oneness,
Right.
right?
Right.
So in a Buddhist tradition that says ultimate truth is nibbana, right? The complete cessation, or not ultimate truth, but enlightenment involves nibbana, right? The complete cessation of all things, so that you can see through every last thing. You can see the unreality and the unmanifested, unconstructed, nibbana. Like if that's the definition of enlightenment, then your trauma is just another veil standing in the way, right? So that
Mm-hmm.
so a form of Buddhism that has that one thread kind of value system cannot make space for the psyche thread, right? It just it's just not it's just another story. There's no way it can be kind of given even just kind of conventional validity in these traditions. Often it's just seen as being something that's a delusion. And I don't think that we need to buy into that as modern people who live in an era where we know a lot more about the unconscious mind and how these things work. We know a lot more than they did 2,000 years ago about these mental processes. And I think we can. I'm just expressing my own opinion here, but I think
Mm-hmm.
we can skillfully we can find more skillful ways of thinking about this material.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean we have to go full on into the psyche thread. Like just I think just like standard therapy, working with trauma from the like from a daily life perspective, like this is something that I need to learn how to, you know, heal and work with within my own sort of biography within my own life, using kind of like talk therapy and other kind of ego based, I'm not saying that in a bad way, ego based
Yep.
like methods of processing can be super super helpful. It's just that's not awakening, but it can be very supportive. So
Yep.
that's not a psyche thread awakening, but that kind of work can be very supportive of other threads kind of
Yep.
awakening. So I'm having an emptiness thread awakening, emptiness and oneness thread awakening, and I'm doing therapy to support, to heal and support it along the way. Brilliant.
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 Yep.
That's great. If it so happens that you have a psyche thread awakening where it's like, oh, wow, everything that I thought was real is actually a projection of my mind. Now you're getting into kind of like some psyche thread territory that, might be even before you have that sort of extreme
Yeah.
of an awakening, even if you have just like the kind of psyche thread awakening that usually comes at the beginning, which
Mm-hmm.
is is often it's just like, oh, what I thought was Pierce is actually some other thing that's actually doing it instead of Pierce. Not focusing on, oh, Pierce is an empty construct, not focusing on,
Mm-hmm.
oh, Pierce is actually God, not focusing on, oh, Pierce is actually just an energetic fluctuation, but it's like, oh, Pierce is this other kind of entity or force or unconscious kind of material that is acting. Um, that's usually the first experience you have in a psyche thread. So it
Mm-hmm.
can be like, oh, I thought I was me, but actually it's my body doing this on some kind of like autopilot, or like, oh, I thought this was me, but it turns out it's this like inner child that's doing it, or oh, I
Mm-hmm.
thought this was me, but it turns out it's this like, spirit entity that's possessed me that is doing this, right? Like all kinds of whatever the
From the
variety.
subtle to like really extreme, verging on
Yeah,
psychosis,
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah,
sort of territory, right?
yeah. All of that
Yeah.
is usually the way psyche thread opens first.
Yeah.
And so if that's so, you can go to the daily life kind of, psychotherapy, EMDR, somatic experiencing, like these kinds of like models that might be
Mm-hmm.
helpful.
Mm-hmm.
They might be helpful. But if your psyche thread opens in a more, let's say, direct,
Full
unavoidable,
on.
and full on kind of way, those may not be they'll be helpful to do, but they may not get to the core. Um, Trying to wish it away by like, seeing it as just a story is just going to kind of like, create tension.
Yeah.
And what I would say is I would turn to the techniques and the schools of thought and the practices that make the most sense for the variety of psyche thread awakening that you've got. So if my psyche thread awakening involves inner child, that's a pretty good indication that you should probably go to like IFS or like some
Mm-hmm.
or Jungian psychology. If you wind up with the kind of psyche thread awakening that's, oh, I thought this was me, but it turns out it's this like archetypal, transpersonal kind of layer of reality. Um, Jungian psychology would be great for that. If it turns out I thought this was Pierce, but I'm actually like possessed by a spirit, shamanism might help with that,
Shamanism. Yep.
right? Oh, I thought this was Pierce doing this, but actually it turns out like I'm this astral being that's like come to this planet from another star. There's some other school of of thought that's going to be helpful with that, right? Whatever flavor of psyche thread awakening you've got, like there are schools of thought and techniques that might be more helpful to navigate that than others. And so
Yep.
just having like a range of options, and sometimes, I mean, often those of us who are practicing kind of like outside of a formal system, it's often just kind of like trial and error, or like what podcast did I happen to listen to that happened to have like speak to me, and
Yeah.
maybe I'll start there, and then see where that takes me. And so yeah, it can be a little bit experimental trying to figure that out. But what I want to
Yep.
do with my model anyway is to validate those kinds of experiences. Those kinds of experiences
Beautiful.
are
Yeah.
real. They happen to a lot of people,
Yeah.
and they are, I think, legitimate. It's a legitimate form of awakening. Like if you follow Jungian psychology all the way through to the end, or you follow shamanism, like not the kind of shamanism where, I want to do a ritual to get some money or something like that. I mean, like
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
real
Yeah.
shamanism, like some of these indigenous traditions. If you follow those to the end, they are real paths of awakening, legitimate, very, very deep, non-dual insights. And I'm just saying, like, if you have this kind of experience, instead of treating it as a pathology, pathologizing this experience as a problem that you need to like get rid of so you can get back to your awakening, instead of
Yep.
doing that, it might, I think, be more skillful to fully embrace what's taking place and look for the right set of tools to navigate it skillfully. And that might be that you need to go through like the psychiatric system, right? In
Yep.
some cases, you mentioned psychosis. In some cases, yeah, this is like you need medication, right? And that, or you need to be
And that's
hospitalized for a little
okay.
while, and
Yeah.
and
That's
that's what you
what.
need, and that's
Yeah.
what you need, and that's if that's what you need, then do it. It's
Yeah.
skillful, right?
Especially if you can't literally function normally. You can't go to work. Your life is literally collapsing because of what's going on. You can't pay bills. I mean,
Yeah,
those would be some clues as to like looking for legit help is completely understandable and
yeah. And,
recommended.
and look what you just said, right? So your criteria that you just gave is daily life criteria, right? If your daily life is falling apart,
Yeah.
right? Daily life type techniques would be the place I would go for help with that. So if my daily life stuff's falling apart, like I can't go to work, I'm having trouble distinguishing like uh material kind of ordinary reality from my like ghost world vision that I have now. If it's really like getting in the way of functioning in daily life, then daily life type interventions would be where I would go for that, right? And so the daily life interventions, by that I mean conventional medical, psychological, psychiatric, medical kind of interventions. If on the other hand, what's happening is you know um my whole world is now, I see now how everything is a spirit entity, and everything is like conscious, and the trees are speaking to me, and there's like animals, spirits in my body. I'm functioning just fine at work. Daily life is functioning just fine. But this is a confusing kind of like thing for me. And how do I navigate this? Well, that's a great indication. You probably don't need to be, I don't think you need to think that you need psychiatric help if you're having a weird experience, but you can still distinguish, conventional sort of ordinary daily life reality from your spiritual experiences. If you're just needing help with what's happening in the spiritual kind of side of things,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then going deeper into that with some shamanism, could be skillful there. If you feel like you need help navigating, um, you know, I mean, you can always, I think it's always an option. It's always, helpful if you're in doubt to have a, it's just like a safety plan in place, right? For like what is potentially, this can be potentially very destabilizing psychological territory, and just having sort of like a friend, a family member or somebody who's like knows what's happening with you, and just being on alert in case you start slipping, right? Something like that could be really
Yeah.
helpful just to have in place. But I think if these are issues that are happening on a spiritual level, then spiritual techniques
Mm-hmm.
can be very helpful there.
Yeah.
And then I I'm talking about them being separate, like spiritual level versus daily life level, because this is the kind of braiding process is what we're talking about right now. Eventually, of course, that all integrates, and it's going to be like, oh, my daily life is not at all separate from my
Separate. Exactly.
spirit beings, but it all integrates in a way that it all becomes very like fluid and manageable and very um
And it's sort of ordinary and matter of fact.
or
It's sort
yeah,
of,
exactly.
yeah, it's like no big deal. I know that like we probably have to wrap up soon because we've been talking for 2 hours now, but I have to tell you, I greatly appreciate your input, and I'm really looking forward to this book, because even if just to normalize this whole thing so people don't feel like they are some sort of spiritual failures. And this is where I think, because there is, at least this is what I noticed, there's so much sort of focus on fixing or getting rid of conditioned self
Yeah.
rather than meeting it fully, right? I think so much suffering just comes out of that. And your book, I think, is very much,
Yeah.
encouraging people to do just that. And I think that, so thank you so much on everybody's behalf for just humanizing awakening, basically,
Yeah.
and bringing it all to this quote unquote spiritual table, so we can look at it. And I think it gets actually easier, because once we get deeper into this process, we discover this, what I call like the safety with capital S. And with that inherent safety, it's so much easier than to look at all the shadowy stuff. And there's no fear of looking at this stuff, because it's no longer being pushed away or demonized or pathologized.
In talking with a lot of people, over the past couple of years since I developed this model, because I talked about it for a long time before I wrote about it. So, I've met plenty of people who have had what I consider like a full all the way through to thread release kind of full awakening process that
Mm-hmm.
never had the psyche thread as a major theme. Um, Everybody still did shadow work or process
Right.
trauma along the way, but sometimes it's not a thread. It's just something that it's just like, can be dealt with in a therapist office, and that's enough.
Yes.
And they sort of like had some processing to do in their meditation or whatever, but it really didn't amount to a thread. It was just kind of like stuff that happened along the way, and wasn't really what I mean by a thread. What I mean by a
Mm-hmm.
thread is it's like a crucial integral part of the awakening process, right? And sometimes
Yeah.
you only see that in retrospect. You're like, oh, okay, now I see how critical those
That was, yeah.
insights were to this whole awakening process. But if you're finding that like every time you do, every time you have like the next big shift happens, and sudden, like you described, all of this material comes up, and I have to process this material. And once I process the material, then it goes back to the next shift, and then it's back to this material. And but if you're finding like, oh, it's a continuous process, it keeps coming up, it keeps
Mm-hmm.
becoming deeper and deeper in with this material drawing my attention, and it really feels like it's really a necessary part of the awakening process, then I would consider that a thread, in which case move away from trying to heal it and kind of like process it and lean into like welcoming this thread as part of your awakening process and really cultivating it. So that's like the big picture, the take
Yeah.
home message of what I'm saying. And then you go from from a stance where the psyche thread material is something that needs to be healed and gotten rid of. It's delusions and kleshas standing in the way of my awakening. And you move to a stance of welcoming more and more and more of this unconscious material to come up and be part of, to be recognized and to be part of the awakening process. And that
Yep.
shift is a huge, right? All the
Massive.
resistance that you were talking about, like this
Yep.
shouldn't be here, this shouldn't be here, right? That's
Yep.
just producing more and more tension, more and more stress, more and more anxiety, more fear, more kind of like getting in the way of like, you know, what the process is trying to happen here. And that just that shift into like, oh, the psyche thread's back. It's not my favorite part of the braiding process, but I'm curious. Like just
Yeah.
that. Like I'm what's gonna come up now? Just that little shift from like fearing it to being like, okay, I recognize this is part of the process. Just that little shift alone takes out a
Massive.
lot of huge. It takes out a lot of that anxiety, a lot of that kind of tension, a lot of that resistance, and it can
A
become
lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of all that stuff,
and
right?
honestly, it can become joyful. Like I, you know, in my process, I got to the point where it was like, oh, this too, okay, you
Yeah.
know,
Bring it.
welcome. Like, okay, that
Yeah.
also. Okay. Oh, this is also a fantasy that I had. Okay. And you kind of like
Right.
it becomes this like cosmic joke, you know,
Yeah.
oh, everything I thought was actually, you know, a thing is just turns out to be another
Yeah.
kind of like, you know, projection of my own mind. And then you start seeing just like how deep that goes in it, and just welcoming it all and just laughing at yourself and your whole conditioned, you know, mess of a self. And you know that little Pierce machine with all
Yeah.
of its little like loops and programming and you know habits and quirks, and you know, and some of those, yeah, some of those are not so, you know, I wouldn't necessarily want to talk about them in public because they're not so nice, and you know, some of them are a little bit sort of disappointing, right? But like the more and more of that Pierce machine kind of like just gets to be itself and do its thing with all of its conditioning and all
Yeah.
of its weirdness, um, the more freedom and liberation there is,
Oh God,
right?
yeah.
So the
And
psyche
then it's
thread
like
is,
on all those layers, just layers and layers and layers that get sort of to
yeah,
experience that, right?
the my life can, you know, my life can be the way it is, my body can be the way it wants to be, my ancestry, I celebrate it, my you know, intergenerational connections with this, that, and the other, my, you know, my mammalian
Mm-hmm.
nature, my maleness, my all of it, you know, and you know, maybe it includes previous lives, maybe it includes, you know, destiny and God and soul and all the other stuff. Like all of it can just be welcome, free to be as
Totally.
it naturally, autonomously wants to express itself, right? And and the whole thing can just be so, yeah. That's why it's its own thread. It's not a sideshow to the awakening process.
Mm-hmm.
It is, you know, when it's a psyche thread awakening, a legitimate psyche thread awakening, it becomes part of the awakening process, and all of that can be welcomed in, and it becomes a joyful expression of the whole thing.
Yeah.
You know, that whole integrated thing that eventually is you're moving towards. Um, and and then there comes a day where the whole process kind of falls away, and it's
Yeah.
just a non-issue. Pierce is the way Pierce is. That's it. There, you know, yeah, there's stuff in there. There's, you know, there's conditioning comes up. Um, sometimes, sometimes
Which
it's
is very different to bypassing. Very different.
right.
It's
It's exactly. It's not bypassing is like trying to skip over the conditioning or just being like, oh, well, I
yeah.
am the way I am. Right. It's not that. It's just like it's just like all of it can just be there. It doesn't need to be monitored. It doesn't need to be
Yeah.
controlled. It doesn't need to be thought about. It doesn't need to be stuffed away. It can just all just like flow, and it can be trusted to flow of its own accord
Yeah.
without needing any of the kind of like spiritual theories or practices or anything there in order to like, manage it and make it safe. It can just like it can just
Right.
it can just be
Manage and
itself.
mitigate. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
The Pierce machine can be the Pierce machine. It can operate the
Yeah.
way it's conditioned to operate, the way it was built to operate. All of it's fine. It just
Right.
it just does its thing.
Amazing.
Um, and yeah, and is it always skillful? No. I mean, right? This isn't about
Definitely
becoming.
not. I can
This
speak
isn't
for
about
myself.
becoming.
Definitely not.
Yeah, this isn't about becoming Jesus or some other like,
Yeah.
Buddha or some other like mythological perfect person, right? This
Or
is not about that.
reaching of some sort of spiritual slash awakened slash
Yeah.
non-dual perfection or
No, no,
whatever
no.
that even means.
It's just like total relaxation and freedom around the conditioning being as it is.
Yeah.
And there
Uh,
being nothing that can't arise. No kind of conditioning that can't, it doesn't mean that I've seen every aspect of the conditioning either, but any aspect of conditioning that arises can just arise. It's okay.
yeah.
There's
Yeah.
there's no need to hide from it or hide it or push it down or make a big deal of it. It's
Yeah.
just
There's
the way
just
it is.
no there I call it like no resistance with capital R. And the reason why I make a distinction is because even if some sort of sensation of resistance arises, you don't even resist that. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
literally you don't even resist
Oh,
resistance, you know?
absolutely. So let me give an example. So I have two kids, and they're now young adults, recently teenagers. Um, Part of my conditioning as this Pierce machine, as a father, as a mammal
Mm-hmm.
that cares for its young, right? Because not all animals do that. If I was a spider, I wouldn't give a crap about my kids, right? But I'm a mammal, and a mammal is like, you know, rather attentive to their children. This system here um has experienced anxiety
I
over
bet.
my children's
Mm-hmm.
well-being. And first time my kids got in a car, first time the kid was in the hospital, first time the kid, whatever, there's been lots and lots and lots of occasions where the conditioning of this being here involves having anxiety for the well-being of children. Now, if I was in an emptiness thread only kind of tradition, all anxiety is just a klesha. It's just a delusion. It's just something standing in the way of, realizing the emptiness of all things. Or if I was in a oneness tradition, it would be like, how could I not believe in God and the trust in the whole perfection of the whole, you know, um, everything's going to happen just as it was supposed to happen, and so on and so forth, right? Like each one of the threads has its own story about, or its own kind of framing about what ultimately awakening should result in. In
Yeah.
the psyche thread framing, human parents feel
Yeah.
feel anxiety about
Figure.
their
Yeah, go
teenage
figure.
children,
Yeah.
and there's no
Yeah.
more or less
Still
to it than
human.
that.
Oh my God. Still
It's not a
human.
it's not a problem, right? Like
Yeah.
yeah. Does anxiety feel good in the body? No. Um, could there maybe be like in a particularly anxious period, might I um maybe do a little breathing exercise in order to sort of like calm down? Might I take a little some like sleepy time tea or something to help me fall asleep at night? Might I do any of those kinds of things? Absolutely. But it doesn't mean there's like some kind of like underlying problem with the
Mm-hmm.
human conditioning being the way it is.
When you said those narratives that you just presented, had I been in emptiness, or had I been in oneness or
Mhm.
whatever, on a thread, just the fact that those narratives and evaluations of the experience arises, oh, this is just the thought, or this is just this is just that
Mhm.
that already tells you that that experience is somehow not welcome exactly as it is,
You're
right?
talking from the psyche thread perspective. That's clear.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
From the psyche perspective, you can see it. You can see all of
Yeah.
that as being deflection, and you can
Yeah.
just see like what is from the speaking like from the psyche thread perspective. What does this organism want? What does this Pierce machine want? It just wants to be itself, and
Right.
it's a it's a parent, and it's gonna feel stressed, and there's no problem with that. It's like it's also going to feel really happy when certain kids do certain things. It's going to be sad when other things, and
Like the human
it's just
experience
human.
stops
Yeah,
being an issue, basically.
it's not an issue. It's just
It's not an issue
it's
to be
just
human and have a
yeah,
human experience and have a parent experience,
yeah.
freaked
and it's
out parent or
and
anxious
it's not
parent.
even like once the so when you're in the psyche thread kind of process, like welcoming more and more of that to be there is
Yeah.
helpful. It's like, oh, oh God, I'm feeling so anxious about this thing. I don't like the feeling of anxiety, but let me welcome the anxiety in. And then you can see, oh, anxiety is just another form of love. Anxiety
Mm-hmm.
for children is a way that love manifests in human parents, and
Mm-hmm.
that kind of like working with it. Let me sit with the anxiety and really see how it's love, and that can be skillful. That can be a very
Absolutely.
helpful
Yeah.
part of that
Yeah.
psyche thread
Yeah.
process. But when you get to the point where the thread is
The whole
totally
thing.
integrated
Yeah.
and you let go of it, then it's just like even that's not necessary. There's no
Yeah.
need to like welcome the human conditioning. It's just fine.
One of the question I think the resistance shows up in a very sneaky ways is when we feel like something comes up to the surface and the question immediately arises, what should I do about it? Or what do I do about it? Which is immediately the expression of how that resistance operates. And that
Yeah,
too is completely fine. This is also totally
that's
normal,
right.
you know?
It's also part of the conditioning. So anxiety arises and you're like, oh, I push it away or I welcome it. I need to do one or the other. Like
Right.
even that impulse is a conditioned human impulse to manage the sensation that you don't like, right?
Right.
So even that is its own level of like needing to do something about this is also conditioned. And
Exactly.
so when the whole thing drops, it's like, oh, human fathers can have anxiety about their kids, and they also can do things to manage that, to so that it's not so uncomfortable in the moment,
Mm-hmm.
and none of it really is a problem. It's just the way you being a human works, and it's fine. It's there's no need to have an opinion about it. It's just that's how
Yeah.
it is. That's it.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. PS, thank you so much. I'm glad
Yeah.
that we managed to
That was fun.
cover this important thread. And like I said, I'm going to put all the links to the book that is yet to be published and to everything else. And thank you so much for watching. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for having me.